From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please offer to house sit while the follow button is on vacation, but once they leave, just go ahead and invite 10 to 15 wild emus into their house, and then leave. This episode is called The Telltale Heartbeat. On a cool fall morning in October of 2000, 27-year-old Maureen Ryan was out for her daily jog. The air felt crisp in her lungs as she kept a brisk pace along the waters of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Until recently, she had been working as a rock climbing instructor out west, so as a result, Maureen was in great shape and very fit. She had always been athletic though, rowing crew and playing lacrosse and field hockey back during her high school days in Pittsburgh. But today, halfway through her very routine run, she suddenly felt woozy and a surge of nausea crept up from her stomach. Maureen slowed to a walk and tried some rhythmic breathing to try to steady her heart rate. Unfortunately, it didn't help. She got dizzier and more lightheaded until it felt like the ground was tilting, and then suddenly it was rushing up at her. The next time she opened her eyes, Maureen was face down on the jogging path, her cheek pressed flat against the cold concrete. Her head absolutely throbbed. She rolled onto her side and began rubbing the bruise on her skull. Maureen felt lucky she hadn't knocked any teeth out when she fell, but at the same time, Maureen just could not understand how her body had just abruptly shut down like that. She had only fainted one other time in her life, and it was back in college after she had gone on an unusually fast treadmill run. Maureen assumed it was just a fluke because it never happened again. But now she wasn't so sure, because just the week before, during another run, she had felt at one point sort of hazy and actually stopped to rest, but that was obviously nothing compared to today, where she actually fell to the ground. And if this had happened while she was on stairs or something, she could have been seriously injured. And so suddenly, Maureen was terrified. It was like she couldn't trust her body anymore, despite having spent so many years working so hard to become strong and healthy and fit. It was like it didn't matter. Her body was going to do whatever it was going to do. Maureen picked herself up and carefully made her way home, and when she got there, she called her Aunt Eileen, who was a doctor in Pittsburgh. Eileen was a pathologist who ran lab tests on tissue, fluids, and organs in order to diagnose diseases, especially heart disease. But she was knowledgeable about most health issues, so Maureen really wanted her opinion on what had just happened to her. Eileen thought for a moment after Maureen told her about how she had just fainted during her run. Then Eileen told Maureen that she might be experiencing some type of irregular heartbeat. If left untreated, Maureen's aunt said that an irregular heartbeat could cause that lightheadedness and fainting that Maureen experienced. But realistically, that was the most mild of symptoms. This irregular heartbeat could lead to permanent damage to her heart, her brain, and other organs. It could even cause strokes, heart failure, and even death. And so Eileen urged Maureen to stop doing any serious exercise until she could meet with a doctor. Maureen appreciated her aunt's advice, but it was hard to accept. Being physically active and pushing her body to its limits made her feel energized, joyful, and alive. To stop exercising cold turkey would be a real challenge for her, but at the same time, she didn't want to risk fainting again, so she promised her aunt that she would take a break from running and would see a doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, Maureen lay on an examination table wearing a hospital gown. She flinched at the feeling of cold metal as the cardiologist stuck a series of electrodes to her chest. Even so, she was still glad to be there. She had not gone for a run since she talked to her aunt, and she was eager for this to be over with. Once the electrodes were in place, the doctor made sure the cables running to the EKG machine were untangled and connected properly. These would convert electrical signals from Maureen's heart into waves displayed on the EKG grid. By studying these lines, the cardiologist would be able to identify any irregularities in Maureen's heart's activity. Maureen closed her eyes and listened as the doctor flicked a switch. The machinery hummed into action, and soon Maureen could hear the beeps corresponding to her heartbeat. 5 minutes later, the test was over, and so Maureen opened up her eyes. The cardiologist quickly pulled up the results on a large computer monitor. His face was neutral as he scrolled through the data, occasionally stopping just to jot something down on a pad of paper. Finally, the doctor scooted his chair back, set down his pen, and turned to face Maureen. He told her he knew why she had been fainting. She had a condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. It's a congenital heart defect that makes the heart beat faster than it should, sometimes causing dizziness and fainting. Maureen was relieved to have a name now for what she'd been experiencing, but she was also shaken at the thought that there was something fundamentally wrong with her heart. The doctor could see how worried Maureen was, and so he told her the good news was that this condition was totally treatable using a procedure called a catheter ablation. It's a surgery where thin, flexible tubes are guided into areas of the heart suspected of causing the irregular heartbeat. Then, once it's in place, the surgeon permanently changes the electrical circuitry of the heart by creating scar tissue in these problem areas. Scar tissue does not conduct electricity, so once that's done, the irregular heartbeat disappears and the heart returns to normal. Maureen thought this procedure sounded really intense and pretty complicated, but she was at least happy to have, the next steps in place. So she thanked the cardiologist and said she would schedule this procedure as soon as possible. Back at home, Maureen called her doctor aunt with the news, and Eileen suggested that Maureen have the catheter ablation done in Pittsburgh where she was, so Eileen could look after her after the procedure was done. Maureen agreed, thanked her aunt, and hung up. Then Maureen went for a long walk along the bay, letting her mind wander. She hoped the sea breeze and the lapping waves might calm her nerves, but she was too distracted. All she could hear was the sound of her heartbeat in every footstep. 2 weeks later, Maureen stood outside a hospital in Pittsburgh with her aunt Eileen. Maureen had barely slept the night before, worrying about this catheter ablation, what could go wrong. But eventually, they went inside the hospital, and they went up to the receptionist desk, and they signed in. Once Maureen's name was called, she hugged her aunt goodbye, and she followed a nurse down the hall to get prepped for the operation. As Maureen settled onto a gurney, the nurse explained that the procedure would take about 3 to 6 hours, but Maureen would be sedated the entire time and wouldn't feel a thing and would just kind of wake up when it was done. Then the nurse had Maureen lie back, and she inserted an IV drip into her forearm. Seconds later, Maureen started to feel the warm and dreamy sensation as the sedatives hit, and soon her eyelids were too heavy to keep open, and she drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, as Maureen drifted back to consciousness, she stared up at the lights on the ceiling. It took her a minute to realize where she was, in a recovery room at the hospital, but once she understood where she was, she noticed her doctor was right there looking down at her. And once the doctor saw she was awake, he told her that the procedure was a total success. He said they had been able to find the section of Maureen's heart that was causing the irregularity, and they covered it with scar tissue. The doctor advised Maureen to schedule occasional follow-up EKG tests just to make sure her heartbeat remained steady, but otherwise, she was good to go. She could go back to her normal life. Maureen could not contain her smile. This was everything she had hoped for, and she could not wait to get back on her feet and go for a run. Two decades later, in October of 2022, Maureen sat on her bed, shivering and dripping wet, holding a phone to her ear and wishing her Aunt Eileen was with her again. She had just made it back to her Seattle houseboat after fainting during that run in Lake Union Park. One moment she was jogging along happily, the next she was unconscious on the ground in the pouring rain, staring at a bunch of rabbits. It felt like her past heart issues were coming back to haunt her. But Maureen just couldn't understand how that would have happened. The catheter ablation operation she did back in 2000 was supposed to have fixed everything. And she had been exercising and living her life normally for years now without any major problems. But now here she was again, 2 decades later, nauseous and dizzy and passing out on the ground. After waiting a while on hold, Maureen was finally connected to a doctor who was inside of her healthcare plan. She told him about fainting in the park and summarized her fairly extensive medical history. The doctor told her to come in the next day for an EKG and also some blood tests. After she hung up, Maureen just sat there staring at the rain landing on the water. She thought she was done dealing with her body's mysteries, but clearly something else was wrong. The next morning, Maureen woke up early, still feeling rattled. She filled a thermos with coffee, put on a raincoat, and headed to her appointment. Once at the hospital, Maureen explained to the cardiologist how her career as a conservation biologist kept her extremely physically active. Even outside of her work, exercise was her favorite activity. In addition to jogging, Maureen skied, she swam, and went mountain biking. Occasionally, she would still experience a bit of dizziness or nausea, but it passed quickly. And every doctor she'd seen in the 22 years since her catheter ablation always told Maureen the same thing. Her vital signs were right where they should be. The cardiologist nodded and took some notes. Then he had Maureen lie back and arranged a series of electrodes on her chest for another EKG. Maureen took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and focused on the soothing hum of the machine as it measured her heartbeat. After a few minutes, the cardiologist pushed back his chair from the computer and came to Maureen's side and helped her sit up. Maureen braced herself for bad news from this test, but the cardiologist only shrugged, shook his head, and told Maureen that her results were normal. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Maureen felt lost and frustrated. She knew the test had to be wrong because she was positive something wasn't right in her body. Last night in the park, she genuinely thought she was going to die. So how could this EKG test show nothing? It made no sense. The cardiologist told Maureen to call if she experienced the symptoms again, but until then, there really wasn't anything he or the hospital could do. Maureen thanked the doctor and appreciated what he was doing, but she knew now it was up to her to do some research of her own. Back at her houseboat, Maureen sat on the deck with a cup of coffee, a stack of books, and a printed copy of her test results. She'd stopped by the library on the way home to check out a few books on heart conditions. Maureen's career as a conservation biologist had trained her to identify patterns in complex data, so studying EKG results did not seem overwhelming to her. The chart showed the electrical energy of her heartbeat on a graph. Each heartbeat looked like a spike as the blood is pushed out, with a little hiccup before and after it. She could see exactly how much electrical energy was being transmitted each time her heart beat, and exactly how long each beat lasted. After looking at these charts for a while, Maureen noticed an irregularity in her heartbeat that the doctor had not mentioned. The amount of time from when her heartbeat spiked to when her heart was ready for the next beat seemed to vary from beat to beat. Sometimes it was very short, and other times it was much longer. This worried Maureen because she knew the heart is supposed to beat very evenly. So she grabbed the phone and called her Aunt Eileen. Her aunt recognized it immediately as a heart condition that can cause fast, unpredictable heartbeats. It's called long QT syndrome, and it's very tricky to diagnose because most patients actually show no symptoms. But for those that do, the most common symptoms are lightheadedness, blurred vision, and fainting, just like Maureen had. Eileen recommended a doctor in Seattle who specialized in heart disorders. If Maureen did have long QT syndrome, he'd be able to confirm it. Maureen thanked her aunt for all her help and said she would call back once she had news. On a cold and gray winter morning the following month, Maureen was back at the hospital in Seattle, this time carrying a bag containing her workout clothes and running shoes. She followed a nurse into the cardiology wing, then into a changing room where she put on her workout clothes. A few minutes later, a man knocked and introduced himself as the doctor that Maureen's aunt had recommended. He led Maureen down the hallway to a larger room with a treadmill right in the middle. The doctor then hooked pulse monitors to Maureen's wrist and forearms, and he explained that he'd be monitoring her heartbeat and blood pressure while she ran on the treadmill. That way, he could determine what was changing inside her body during vigorous exercise. Maureen did some stretching and then began a brisk walk as the doctor slowly accelerated the treadmill. Soon, Maureen was sweating, huffing, and running at full speed. And all the while, the doctor just kept his eyes on his screen. And after running for a little bit, Maureen suddenly felt a very familiar sensation. Her peripheral vision turned foggy, her head felt woozy, and then before she could do anything, she was falling face first onto the rubber mat of the treadmill. When Maureen blinked back to consciousness, she looked up and saw this big group of men and women wearing hospital scrubs crouched down around her. One of them reached down and helped scoop her up into a sitting position. And as they did that, Maureen realized this was an emergency resuscitation team that had been called in when she fainted to resuscitate her. The doctor who had been overseeing the running test came over and crouched down by Maureen's side. He explained that her blood pressure and heart rate had plummeted when she was running, and then she passed out. It happened too fast for anyone to catch her. But the doctor told her that this test had actually been really useful because the results showed her issue wasn't a problem with her heart. It was more likely a complicated fainting condition sometimes seen in athletes. For Maureen, intense exercise was short-circuiting the nerve endings that regulated her heartbeat. This caused her blood pressure to drop, which in turn slowed the flow of blood to her brain. This is what made her feel lightheaded and dizzy to the point of fainting. Maureen, who was still sitting on the treadmill, was dazed by the diagnosis. Every doctor she had seen for the past 20 years had told her there was something wrong with her heart, that was the issue. But now it sounded like the problem was actually in her brain. Maureen asked the doctor, what do I do? How do I keep myself from fainting? The doctor smiled and told Maureen she was actually in luck. To get around the nerve issues and stabilize her blood pressure, all she would need to do was consume 1.5 teaspoons of ordinary table salt every day. Now, that's more salt than most people consume on a daily basis, but it was just enough above the normal amount that it would raise her blood pressure to the point where she would not faint the next time she did strenuous exercise. This sounded almost too easy to Maureen, but at the same time, she was grateful that she had a cure. She got to her feet, thanked everyone, and then went to go buy some salt. But a month later, on a cloudy, rainy Seattle afternoon, Maureen, who was very frustrated, stepped out onto the deck of her houseboat and dumped her salt into the water. She was totally done with this cure. Daily doses of salt had done nothing. For weeks, Maureen had been dissolving salt in a tall glass of warm water and forcing herself to drink it. At first, she held out hope that she might eventually start to see some changes, but she never did. Consuming all this salt had only made her bloated and anxious. It did nothing for her heart. Even on light jogs, Maureen's chest would feel tight, her stomach would turn queasy, and she'd be out of breath like she was about to faint. So whatever was wrong with her heart was definitely still wrong, and the salt was doing nothing to fix it. Frustrated, Maureen again called her Aunt Eileen for advice for what felt like the millionth time. This time, Eileen recommended that Maureen reach out to a very specific physician named Dr. Samir Saba, who specialized in a very special kind of MRI scan that identifies diseases and defects in the heart. Despite the diagnosis Maureen had received, Eileen still thought there really could be issues with her heart. And so this special MRI test, which gives very detailed pictures of the heart, might actually finally answer what was going on with Maureen. Now, Maureen was skeptical that anybody could figure out her mysterious condition after so many other doctors had tried and failed, but she had nowhere else to turn, and so Maureen asked her aunt to go ahead and book her one of these special MRI scans with Dr. Saba, and while she did that, Maureen would buy a flight to Pittsburgh. A week later, Maureen sat nervously in the front passenger seat as her Aunt Eileen drove to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Maureen watched out the window as a soft drizzle fell across the city, the same damp gray weather she was used to back in Seattle. She looked forward to being back on her cozy houseboat, but before she could go home, she still had this one last test she had to take. Maureen shuddered at the sight of yet another hospital as they got out and began walking towards the building. Once they went inside, Maureen followed a nurse through several sets of double doors into a white-walled, brightly lit MRI room. The nurse helped Maureen get undressed while she explained the procedure. A magnetic resonance image, or MRI, can create 3D images of the organs and tissues inside of a person's body. These detailed images allow doctors to find heart damage without needing to perform surgery on the patient. Maureen climbed up onto the stark white table and laid down flat. She heard a machine whir, then the table, with her on it, slid inside a narrow tube. At first, it felt claustrophobic, but Maureen shut her eyes and just pictured herself going for a run, and it put her at ease. Maureen lay there, listening to the sounds of the imaging machine, and then after about an hour, the noises stopped, and she, on her gurney, was slid back out from the tube. Maureen sat up, feeling strangely relaxed. Dr. Saba was there waiting for her, and he told her it would take a couple of weeks to get the results back, but he would call her as soon as he could. 2 weeks later, Maureen was back on her houseboat in Seattle, Washington, when her phone rang. The caller ID said University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Bracing herself for more frustrations or worse, Maureen answered and heard Dr. Saba's voice on the line. He told her he had some absolutely wild news. The issue with Maureen's heart was something that none of her previous doctors had thought of. Not only that, but it was something Maureen had lived with her entire life. The problem with Maureen's heart had nothing to do with its beat or nerve endings or scar tissue or any of the other things doctors had talked about for all these years. Instead, Maureen's heart was the wrong shape. The major artery carrying the blood from Maureen's heart to her body was literally in the wrong place, and so her unusual anatomy was causing Maureen's blackouts, not all the other rare conditions that doctors had thought previously. Maureen's right coronary artery was squished underneath another large blood vessel so that it was slightly constricted. When Maureen went about her normal activities, there wasn't any issues. But when Maureen exercised, her heart had to beat faster and pump more and more blood to keep up. But since her artery was in the wrong place and compressed, eventually it couldn't hold enough blood to meet the needs of the heart. This caused Maureen to faint. And no doctor would ever think to suspect this as the cause, because less than 1% of the entire population has a structural defect like this one. But the dangers of this rare condition are extremely real. Dr. Saba told Maureen that her collapse in the park was more likely a heart attack, and if it had lasted much longer, she would have died. Maureen was speechless. Across 20-plus years of seeing doctors throughout the country, no one had ever mentioned even the existence of a condition like this. She'd been living with a misshapen heart since she was born, and without Dr. Saba, it's very possible she would have never found out and likely died from it. Later that summer, Maureen underwent a 3-hour-long open-heart surgery at the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, in which surgeons successfully moved her right coronary artery, the one that was in the wrong spot, over to its proper location. Maureen still has lingering chest tightness and fatigue, but the operation allowed her to go back to her physically active life without fear. Gradually, she was able to start fully exercising again, and though her speed is not what it once was, Maureen has never fainted since. Evening hours of January 12, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. His mother would say it was obvious Dylan had been drinking because he was slurring his words, but at the time, even though she was upset about it because he was underage, she thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by two people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards that hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness, where there's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, they would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through kind of rough, rocky, snowy terrain through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks, and then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation. So about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old, it was March of 2013, and he finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild. And so he told his family he was gonna go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly, but even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing. And before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin, where he said he's lost on this mountain, and even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her, and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in the area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road. And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found, and he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees. And as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees, and he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road, he wasn't that far away. Heck, he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape, and in theory, he would have known where he parked it, or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag, and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said we don't know for sure. So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, the woods just went completely silent. Very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her, and she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess. And so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it. And I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it and I had a clear shot of this thing. So I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself. You know, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. You know, she just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head. And as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens and that's it. That night when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, you know, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, you know, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him, and so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, you know, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, like, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, you know, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, you know, what she saw, And based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. A 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setti's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had that begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm going to be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries, all from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet. So let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child, and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor, and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with the doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? But the doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place, and doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building, but she didn't know where it was, and she's 3-4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up crying. Because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden. It's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now. You live here. You've never lived anywhere else. Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, I'm home, I'm with my people. This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed because people are like looking at them like, what's going on with your child? She finally leaves with her parents, but at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble, and in fact, they said, you can't come to Sunday school anymore. Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, that is my home. That's where I'm from, right there, Temple of Seti I. In Abydos, Egypt. That's my home. And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture, and she's like, that's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this? Like, she didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden, but she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answered her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, I'm home, I'm home. Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hora, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her, he couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hora was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was in fact about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hora, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story. And it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Eady, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben Trishit took her own life. Edie's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Eady anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple but the people who lived there, because it was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up a office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, if you dig here, you're going to find this garden. And sure enough, they dug down and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed. And once they dug it up, she was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it, and there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax. But they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a secret underneath the temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, I mean, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. So that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this, please like the video and hit subscribe. I'm going to be posting multiple times a week stories about the strange, mysterious, dark stuff. If that's the kind of thing you like, then I'm the channel for you, I hope. Also, please follow me on TikTok. My handle is also MrBallen. And then on Instagram, it's JohnBallen416. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. See ya.